Welcome to the Cinematic Void podcast. Cinematic Void is a cult film series that hosts screenings in Los Angeles, or at least we did before the pandemic. You can find Cinematic Void on the World Wide Web at cinematicvoid.com, as well as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, SoundCloud, Apple Podcast, and Patreon, which makes this podcast possible. And don't forget, every Friday at 8:30 p.m. Pacific through the end of the quarantine is Cinematic Void Up All Night in the Cinemanus movie. Each week, I host a virtual screening of a mystery movie with vintage commercial breaks, trailers, and more. You can tune in at cinematicvoid.com/midnight to spend your late nights in the void. I'm your host, Jim Branscombe, and join me through the power of the internet is...
Hey, what up? It's Nick Vance. Find me at Paranoid Futures on Twitter, Letterboxd, Instagram, all that stuff.
And we also have another special guest this week. He is a graphic designer, avid skateboarder, coffee aficionado, and a cult movie buff. He's designed things for Levi's, DC shoes, and most importantly for this podcast, he designed the Cinematic Void logo, all of our posters, t-shirts, you name it. Please welcome Eagle Barber. How you doing, Eagle?
Great. What's up, guys? Stoked to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So we're just going to jump into it. Now, when you start getting into like punk and hardcore, and I should mention you've been in tons of punk and hardcore bands, and you're an avid movie watcher. At what age, actually, let me back that up. When did you start becoming obsessed with like cult movies and like punk rock and stuff? Was it at the same time, or was it just two things that happened at different times and then converged together?
I got into movies first and foremost when I was really, really young. And I think it was probably a combination of the fact that I had pretty lax parents who kind of let me watch whatever I wanted to watch. So, I mean, I was a child of the 80s, so I kind of came up in the VHS boom. So, like, my Friday nights usually revolved around, like, going to the local video store and, like, renting the most disturbing videos I could find solely based on, like, the VHS cover. And on top of that, like, my dad was a huge Twilight Zone fan, so when I was a kid, he was always watching, like, the old reruns of Twilight Zone. And then my mom was also, like, a huge Hitchcock fan, and she was, like, a big mystery reader. So, like, my mom was watching Hitchcock movies. My dad was, like, a Twilight Zone, like, 1950s monster movie kind of a guy because he grew up in that era. And then I had, like, the 80s VHS stuff, so I had, like, this little conglomeration of dark entertainment sort of swarming around me. So I got into movies at a really young age. And thankfully, like I say, my parents were pretty cool. Didn't really mind me watching that stuff when I was probably way too young to be watching it. So that was kind of my first dip into like the world of movies and horror and stuff for sure.
Now, was there a particular movie? Because there's always a movie that kind of pushes you further from like the, dare I say, mainstream, like, movie horror, that like the Friday the 13th stuff. What was there a movie that kind of pushed you more towards like the weirder and more occult stuff?
That kind of came later, like I say again, because like coming up in the 80s, like my favorite movies as a kid were like all of this slasher stuff that was coming out. Like actually the first home video like VHS that we owned in my house was actually the first Friday the 13th. And like the first movie I saw that really kind of like dug its hooks in, like no pun intended, was like the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which still to me is like probably my all-time favorite horror movie. It really wasn't until I like was probably into my teenage years that I started getting into like the really weird stuff or like some of the European stuff. The first movie I saw that totally like opened my eyes to like the Italian and the European stuff that was going on was I went to a midnight screening of The Beyond when I was like 18 years old. I think it was the year that like Grindhouse and Rolling Thunder had done the restoration, and they put it back in theaters like 97, 98. I got to go to a midnight screening of that, and it was the first Fulci I'd ever seen. It was probably like the first Euro like Italian gore shit I had ever seen, and it just like totally blew the doors off like everything for me. And then on top of that, again, there was a video store in Seattle at the time called Video Vertigo, and it was an all VHS rental place for the longest time. But that's where I discovered like all the Argento stuff and all the European stuff from the 70s. So that was just sort of like seeing The Beyond on the big screen, like at this midnight movie, was just like a totally religious experience for me. And it like busted the doors open to like all that stuff for me.
Because I kind of find that once you start getting into like not necessarily Italian horror, but you start going deeper and deeper, it becomes more of an obsession because at the time, at least when you and I and Nick were growing up, it was a lot harder to see a lot of these movies, and especially uncut. Were you chasing after like bootlegs or like Laserdisc or anything, any of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, very similar. It's funny. You and I talked about that just a little bit the other day, but one of the benefits that I had was, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with Something Weird Video.
Yeah.
But what a lot of people don't understand is that before the age of like Anchor Bay and like Blue Underground were really like exploding with like DVD and Blu-ray, like you could not get a copy of The Evil Dead like to own. Like you could not just go out and buy like a DVD of The Evil Dead like in the late 90s. And so like Something Weird Video would get Japanese laser discs, and then they would make VHS bootleg copies of like the Evil Dead trilogy and all those other movies, and they would sell them as VHS bootlegs like in these big clamshells. And so like there was a time when like I literally like ordered from like a paper mail order catalog from Something Weird, and that's like the first way I got a hold of like my own physical like personal copy of the Evil Dead movies was a VHS bootleg from an Asian Laserdisc. And like that's what you had to do. Like it took a lot more legwork, you know, like you had to like be really creative. Thankfully though at the time, like places like Something Weird were doing that. And obviously I'm like the legal ramifications, like who knows, you know, but like, and it's funny because it wasn't until like I'd say maybe like couple of few years after that, you started seeing like companies like Anchor Bay or these like distribution companies were popping up that were getting the rights to all these movies, and you could go to like Suncoast or like Sam Goody in the mall and start finding all the stuff on DVD. But like just a few years prior, like I don't think people understand or remember how hard it was to come by some of this stuff. Like it was a lot of work.
Now, I definitely remember trips to the video store where I specifically was looking for things that like you couldn't own, because I remember trying to ask and like, hey, local video store, let me just buy your copy of Evil Dead 2. And they're like, yeah, $80, because that's how much it costs to get a new one. So it's just like, all right, I'm just going to rent this, hook up 2 VCRs and tape it.
For sure.
I mean, that's how I got a lot of my stuff. It was like bootlegs of Laserdisc, just illegally doubling VHS that I rented just to have my own personal copies. Because it's just like, why rent this for another 800 times when the tape's going to probably get fucked up at some point and just make my own dupe. And I should say I'm not knocking DVD, because I love DVD, because I remember when DVD happened and I started looking at my old like VHS bootlegs from specifically the Beyond. I had a Japanese Laserdisc rip to VHS of the Beyond. And I remember when that first Beyond DVD came out and I put it on and I did a side-by-side comparison, I was like, fuck, I'm never going back to VHS after this.
It's crazy. And I mean, like you say, like the first copy I had of that was legit was that Anchor Bay Beyond in that giant tin with like the collectible postcards. I actually still have it. But the thing, it's like, it was funny because you'd always find those like when they started to pop up at video stores, and you know, like they always had the sticker on the back, it was like limited to X amount of copies or whatever. It's like you had to buy up all that stuff thinking like they only made a certain amount of DVDs. But yeah, that was like the first copy that I owned was like one of those big collectible like tins of the Beyond. And it was so cool that you could, I guess it's like pros and cons. It was cool that like fans could find that stuff like a lot easier and it was like more readily available. But it sort of killed some of the fun of like having to get really creative and like having to search out stuff and like really put the legwork into like hunting down these little companies that were either making bootlegs or, like you say, like making dubbed copies at home. Like that was sort of some of the fun and the mystery of getting into movies. And at the same time, like it makes it so much easier to build up like your home library when like there's distribution companies that started putting that stuff out regularly, and it made it a lot easier to get it, which, you know, in its own way is pretty cool.
You know, it's kind of a blessing and a curse, because like, you know, you do miss out on the fun of the hunt when like everything is, you know, readily available now, whether it's like streaming or there's a nice Blu-ray restoration, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I do kind of miss the chase, which is why when I come across things I've never seen from like the 60s, 70s, or 80s, it just blows my mind. Yeah. You talked about Something Weird Video and being from Seattle. Did you ever get any of the original like Something Weird VHS when they were putting out the stuff that they legit own?
Yeah, like I actually still have like original DVDs of like the Herschel Gordon Lewis stuff, like Blood Feast and like 2000 Maniacs and all that stuff. Like I still have those Something Weird like actual DVDs too. And then those really like lousy little snap case covers, like with a little plastic lip on the side that kind of,
Yeah.
the whole sleeve is like just like a sleeve of cardboard. But I still have those as well, yeah, which is super cool. And again, like that whole world was like a whole other facet of horror movies that like I had no comprehension of as a kid. Like, so when you start to see something like all the H.G. Lewis stuff and you realize like how far back it goes and how much it predates all the other stuff, that started to like totally blow my mind.
Now, as you got deeper into cult stuff, was there any particular subgenre that you liked a lot more and really got deeper in at any point? I know you mentioned Fulci. Was there like anything like, was it Italian like horror, Spanish horror, like more like weird 70s grindhouse stuff?
Definitely like the 70s European stuff, like sort of became one of my favorites. Like, because again, I went from like the kind of 80s VHS boom where like everything was a slasher, like Friday the 13th kind of spin-off. And then once I saw The Beyond and sort of discovered like Fulci and Argento and all those guys, I just fell like way deeper down that rabbit hole. And that's probably like, I guess if like hard pressed to pick like sort of my favorite era or my favorite genre, it's definitely like the 70s Euro stuff for sure.
I think this is why we get along so much because like
Yeah.
if I had to pick an era, it's definitely 70s Euro horror.
For sure.
I know America was doing groundbreaking stuff at the time because obviously Texas Chainsaw came out, Dawn of the Dead. But like there's just something to say, especially in the Italian cycle where they were doing knockoffs of like a lot of genres. Like they were doing when French Connection came out, there was 8 million Italian French Connection like knockoffs. And I just for the next Cinematis movie, I did a bunch of the Italian Exorcist ripoffs, which after the Exorcist they cranked out a shit ton of those. And the thing is, like, yeah, they're chasing like a genre that was popular, but like the way they made the movies was just completely unique because most of the time they were just absolutely fucking insane. They took the basic premise and just not only ran with it, but ran with it while set on fire almost.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's totally surreal. Like to see one of those movies like for the first time, especially when you're younger. Like again, like I'll keep going back to it, but when I strolled into that midnight movie to see The Beyond, like I didn't know anything about that movie. Like it wasn't exactly pre-internet, but it wasn't like the internet like it is today. It was certainly pre-smartphone. Like no one was really on the internet. So it's like I literally had that like really organic, natural event of like going to the Varsity Theater in the U District in Seattle and seeing this poster for The Beyond. And it was the reissue poster. So it had like the creepy blind woman and like all the zombies in the background, like this really bright, bold colors. And all you really had was the poster. Again, it was almost like harkening back to going to the video store. So I saw this poster and I was like, I don't even know what the hell this is, but I obviously have to go see this movie. And so to discover things like that in a really like natural and organic way is something that I think a lot of people are probably starting to miss out on these days. And like a lot of younger people who are probably getting into movies or music or art or any of that stuff, it all goes back to that same like analog quality of like discovering something like in a totally natural way, or like buying a record because you look at the back and you see that like the live photo looks like something exciting, or you look and you realize like a record has come out on the same label as another record that you like that's how we used to buy records. And so that when that sort of like opened me up to like cinema, like I got really lucky in that I got to discover it in a way that was like really, like it sounds silly and cliche, but it was a really pure way to discover that stuff. And I sat there in the theater watching The Beyond, and I legitimately at that time, I had never seen anything like that in my life. Like it was cool, it was scary, it was gory, it was silly, like it was weird. Some of the production was questionable, but like again, like that's what made it all amazing. And like that's why it was so surreal and bizarre. And you were like, man, like I've never seen a movie like this because it's an Italian movie, and I've just seen American films up until that point as far as horror stuff goes. So it just, yeah, it totally was like this religious, like church going experience for me.
After like chasing down movies on VHS and like after you've seen The Beyond, did you become more hip to like repertory screenings at the time and try to go see more obscure things that were playing on film prints or anything like that?
For sure, yeah, like all the time. And I mean, that was kind of the thing too. It was just at that age and at that era was probably this like the same time that a lot of people really start to get into film. I mean, I was like a teenager, so you know, at that time it was not only the repertory stuff, but it was like kind of that boom of a lot of like the indie stuff that was becoming like really in the forefront of like all the cinema going stuff. Like it was like the birth of all your like Wes Andersons and all that kind of stuff. So there was like this really boom, I think, in cinema, like for our generation around that time, just as there was for like the old school guys in the 70s or the, you know, the French New Wave in the 60s and all that stuff. Like I think for our generation, that sort of like late 90s, that like post Tarantino kind of world that produced all these like kind of indie type filmmakers, like all that stuff was happening. So I was digging into like everything I could kind of get my hands on. And I mean, I was going to the movies religiously, and it was everything from like horror stuff and repertory old stuff, which again, thankfully, like at that time, living in Seattle, we had the Varsity, and we had a place called the Grand Illusion, which is like one of the best theaters in the country. And they would do these events. Like there was one year, several years later, they did like an entire Mario Bava retrospective. So like every single night of the week, they were playing like 2 or 3 Bava films, you know? And so it's like every night I was going to the movies and getting to see like Mario Bava stuff on the big screen and discovering all these movies I had never seen or heard of, you know?
Now, we talked about how you getting into the movies and cult films and stuff. How'd you end up getting into punk rock and hardcore?
It probably all stemmed from skateboarding. Largely probably from like ads in the back of Thrasher magazine when I was a little kid. I got my first skateboard in like 1985 or 1986, and it was a Veriflex. I actually still have a version of it today. But I got my first board like Christmas 1986, and at the time I was just a kid. Like I would like try to learn to like go down my driveway and shit. The next couple of years, like I got my first like legitimate professional kind of board, and I ended up getting like a Pal Peralta from my parents, and it was like decked out with like legitimate trucks and had like big Rat Bones wheels. And so I got really into skateboarding probably around like by the time I was 9 or 10, it was like all I wanted to do. And so of course my parents got me a subscription to Thrasher, and then later on I got into Transworld too. But Thrasher was always kind of my go-to. And it would just be like stuff from like flipping through the back and seeing these crazy ads and like always seeing Misfit skulls. I feel like every Thrasher in that era like had a Sessions like records ad or something that were like selling Misfits t-shirts. And so I started to just sort of like put all the dots together in that way. And it's like a lot of it was just the imagery, like everything else. There was so much like visceral and like appealing imagery to like records and t-shirts and stuff that I would see in the back of like skate magazines, that I would just start again like mail ordering stuff, sending money out in like a well-concealed envelope and getting records or t-shirts. Or also like with Thrasher, like there were periods where you could renew your subscription, and like they would send you like X, Y, or Z record or whatever. They had all these like tie-in promotions. And I remember I got Seaweed had put out Week back like in the early 90s. And I remember renewing my subscription to Thrasher, and I got a copy of Seaweed Week like on cassette, and like stuff like that, you know, was going on when you were a kid. So it was just like, again, kind of like the movies that came later, you know, you'd get a record and you'd study it and you'd find out like what label it was on, and you'd read through the liner notes and the thanks list, and you'd try to search out all the bands that people thanked. I mean, these are like stories that anybody our age and older knows, you know, but again, like it just all stemmed from that like introduction to like skateboarding at the time. For me was such a counterculture thing. It was probably like many years later, like into the early mid 90s, when it kind of became cool, and it kind of became like the shift, the focus kind of shifted to like a whole other kind of thing. And then it wasn't really punk, and it wasn't scary, and it wasn't like skulls and blood and stuff. And like, I mean, when I was coming up, every skateboard I wanted had like skulls or zombies or gory stuff on it. So it's just like that visual connection to that stuff, like just leads you down all these rabbit holes. And that's really how I probably discovered that kind of music. I mean, again, like my dad was a classic rock guy, so he had records and he listened to Zeppelin and like Jimi Hendrix and all that stuff. So when I was a tiny little kid, I thought Led Zeppelin was like the heaviest band in the world. I thought they were like the loudest, like heaviest thing I'd ever heard in my life. And so as a kid, I thought that was really cool. So I think I was always drawn to like loud, heavy music. It was just very different back then. And it was like classic rock, you know, from my dad's record collection. But yeah, Thrasher magazine, definitely, it played a huge part in like really shaping who I am today. I mean, I really haven't changed my interest much in like 30 years. I'm pretty consistent in like what I'm into and the things I do. It's really been a long journey at this point.
At what point did you become interested in playing music?
Again, I was really young, man. My dad played music. My dad's a drummer primarily as well. He plays guitar and stuff too, but he's mostly a drummer. And so when I was a kid, obviously like I wanted to play drums. So that was the first instrument that I got into. And my dad always played like blues and rock and stuff. And he was always in a band when I was a kid, like not like an original act. It was like touring or anything, but he was always in a band. And they would always play covers and stuff. And they play like blues and rocks. They were playing like Hendrix tunes and like Stevie Ray Vaughan and shit. And like he was all into that stuff. So about the time that I was like probably actually too small to even really like be able to play, I would like try to sit up on the throne, like on the drum stool and try to play drums. So again, I got really lucky that I had a lot of music in my family. My dad was probably like the biggest factor. And, you know, like they didn't push any of that stuff on us or anything, but it's just because it was so prevalent in the house, it made it really easy to just sort of like kind of glide right into it. Like we had a piano in the house, we had guitars in the house. My dad always had a drum set up like either in the garage or like some part of the house, and he played music. So I started playing at a really young age. But it was, you know, I was like terrible. I would put on headphones and like I put on like a Walkman, I put a tape in and then put my headphones on and like try to play drums along to songs. And that was like the first way I started playing music. And then for a while I was doing like, you know, find kids in the neighborhood that were like starting to play or whatever. And we would play terrible covers. And I went through periods like I'd play with a guy that always wanted to play like Green Day songs. I play with other guys that were kind of more like metal dudes. And so again, it was just sort of like a natural progression. It was really easy to get into because there was so much of it in my house coming up.
Now, what was the first serious band and by serious I mean the band that started writing songs and actually playing shows and recording demos and that kind of stuff? What was the first serious band that you ended up being in?
Such a relative term. I mean, I think I was probably in a band that did a demo pretty early on. I mean, because again, like I got really lucky that my dad had a 4-track reel-to-reel recorder. So he had a little, like he always had kind of a pseudo studio at home. So anytime I was like starting bands at a really young age, we would always just go in and record like a little quote unquote demo on like a 4-track reel-to-reel. There's probably like demos out there that probably go back to like when I was like 13 or 14. Like I'd be hard pressed to really come up with those. So it probably wasn't honestly till I was like college age, like 18 and on, like I was really playing in bands that were actually like playing shows somewhat regularly and like putting out music and actually like going on tour and stuff. And that was like one of the first hardcore bands I played drums in was a band called Last Man Standing. And it was just, I mean, it's terrible. Like hindsight, it's really terrible. Like at the time, like it was fine. It was pulling from a lot of like really generic elements of like various hardcore scenes. Like I don't even really know what kind of music it was. It was probably like kind of metally. It was kind of heavy, like hardcore, but a lot of people in that band I became really good friends with, and we actually continued playing music and like got into bands that we took a little more seriously and probably thought were a lot better, because like the core of that, like 4 of the 5 of those guys ended up being in the same bands like over the next several years, like over and over again. So I was able to kind of find like a core group of friends and musicians after that. But that band was like, you could probably like find CDs or something out there. Like we went on, I think like we did like one West Coast tour at the time and like put out a CD. Like we didn't even put out vinyl. Actually, we have a split 7-inch with like another Seattle band, but not very good. Played a lot of shows, went on one little tour, and like I say, a lot of those guys continued on to start other bands. But all that stuff really probably didn't kick in until I was like 18 and like sort of old enough to really like leave town or go on tour or like kind of do stuff on my own.
I was going to ask, if you don't mind, you're straight edge, and I assume you've been straight edge most of your life, if not your whole entire life. Was that through punk and hardcore that you kind of decided to go that way, or was that just something natural that just from who you are?
It was kind of a combination, actually. It was I've been straight edge now for 25 years, so it's not something that like I even really think about anymore. It's not something that like I imagine is ever going to go away. I was 15 years old when I started calling myself that. And it was a combination of things. Like there was a lot of alcohol and drug abuse in my family. So to me, it made it really easy to rebel against that stuff, kind of go the opposite direction, where I feel like with a lot of kids who come up in a really clean cut kind of family or home, like their act of rebellion is getting into drugs and drinking. And for me, it was really like the most punk thing I could do was go the other way. Like the total act of rebellion for me was not getting into drinking and drugs. So like I did stupid stuff when I was a kid. Like still beers from my dad or whatever. But when I was 15, again, like a lot of people will say, like I discovered like Minor Threat, you know, and suddenly I found a band that was like saying things that I already felt and that I was already sort of getting behind. I just didn't really know there was a world for it. I didn't really know there was a term for it. So it made it really easy to sort of identify with that. And I think that's crucial as a kid, because when you're 15, like you have all these pressures to sort of identify as something or identify with a certain group. And suddenly I found this band that was playing like ragingly fast punk, like hardcore, and they were like singing about being sober and like singing songs about being straight edge. And so it was easy for me to put those pieces together and go like, oh, like that's what I am. I just thought I was a fucking nerd who was into punk and skateboarding, but wasn't into drinking and doing drugs and getting crazy. And I always felt like it really made me kind of lame. So when I found that in music and I found that in Minor Threat, it was like a light bulb went off on my head. And then it was like, oh, okay, that's what I identify with. I didn't know this was a thing that existed. So again, it was kind of easy. And I sort of had some negative influence in my life to kind of push me in a more positive direction.
At what point in your, musical journey did you find like the actual hardcore scene, and that there were things beyond like the Misfits and Minor Threat and all that stuff that you typically find with skateboarding and all that stuff?
You know, man, like I got lucky again in that I started meeting some older kids. So when I was like 14 and 15, I was sort of meeting and hanging out with kids that were like 16 to 18 and like sometimes even older. So I started like learning about what shows were around that time, probably like, which would have been like 94, probably like between 93 and 95. It's like you started realizing like shows were a thing and there was like a scene and like, you know, bands were playing locally and it was like youth oriented and like the audience were kids. So I was pretty young. Like I was at the age where either like my mom was dropping me off at a show down the street, or I was hitching a ride with kids that were way older than I was, which somehow, again, like my parents were cool with. But I was definitely like, when I first discovered that stuff, I was way too young to really be cool or to really be a part of it or to think that like I really knew what it was about. Like I think one of the first bands I went to see was like Sloppy Seconds.
Nice.
Which like, I mean, like again, like when you're a kid, and especially when you're like a kid who's like gravitating towards like straight edge, like Sloppy Seconds is like the last thing in the world you think you want to listen to. But I remember like distinctly like seeing that band at a young age and was like, this is the greatest thing I've ever seen. Because it's like, again, it was all kids and like people were stage diving and like crowding over each other, and it was just like this loud raucous thing. But like now at 40, or like even for the last like I don't want to listen to Sloppy Seconds, man. But like truth be told, they were one of the first like punk bands I saw as a really young kid. So it's certainly like it was cool at the time. I can't say that I'm like a Sloppy Seconds fan today, but
well, it's a good era for them.
Yeah, you get into things however you get into it, you know. Like there's probably like, I mean, there's probably a lot of bands from like back when I was a kid that I still listen to, but like some of the first bands I saw, like you just went to see everything. If it was like a punk show, like you'd go to the show and you thought it was cool because it was a show.
Right. It was the 90s. There's like ska.
Yeah.
You know?
Man. Like, you know, again, like it's not a point of pride. Again, it's like I was a kid and like I got to play music and that was cool. But it's like I don't like ska. I don't listen to it, you know, like.
Yeah, you just end up checking out everything and see what sticks.
Yeah, it wasn't Sloppy Seconds. I think I'd probably rather listen to ska. I apologize if Sloppy Seconds ever hears this.
You talked about playing live. What was the Seattle like punk and hardcore scene like at the time? Because I know like maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 years tops before that, that was the big grunge movement. And I know grunge does have some elements of punk and hardcore thrown in there, usually from the earlier SST bands. But what was it like in Seattle, like scene wise?
Seattle's like very insular. It feels very much like a small town in a big city. So, and you also have to understand like it's very isolated. So it's not like California or the Midwest or the East Coast, especially the East Coast, where you can go out as a band on tour and play like every single night with really short drives. Like to get to Seattle, it's a nightmare. So the hardcore scene felt very, very small and insulated, but at the same time, like very supportive. And the thing is like everyone was sort of friends and everyone sort of knew each other. So everyone sort of supported everyone's bands. And there was a period there, obviously, like when I got heavily into going to hardcore shows and all that stuff, when, you know, that golden age of like 18 to 20, there was like a lot of bookers happening that like were doing bigger and better shows at places like the Rock Candy, and like there was the Velvet Elvis at the time. So there were like really great things happening, but I don't really know how it would compare to like East Coast stuff or Southern California stuff at the time, because again, like to get to Seattle from like the East, which I think like maybe your last hope is like playing a Boise show, or to get to Seattle from Northern California, like you got to pretty much go from like NorCal all the way to Portland and then on to Seattle. So I think that probably dissuaded a lot of bands from coming up. I mean, obviously, like I haven't talked to bands that used to tour, but just from a perspective of getting out of Seattle and going on tour, I know that like that first haul was always the hardest, just because there's nothing up in Washington State and Oregon State for the longest time. So it really feels like this little island. And as big of like a metropolitan as Seattle is, and how much it's become even bigger of one these days, the hardcore, like quote unquote, kind of punk hardcore scene just felt very, very small, but very, very like connected and really supportive of each other. And it was so much easier. Like I'm still playing music today, but like as a kid or at that age, I feel like you could start a band with your friends. You put out a demo, you give the demo to everyone you know and all your friends, and you hand them out or sell them at shows. And then everyone comes and sees your band, and everyone just supports it because like it's your friends or it's a small local band. And it just felt like really easy back then to sort of exist in that world and like playing music and stuff. It just felt like a very natural, like everyone supports everything because you sort of have to kind of a vibe.
At what point did you leave Seattle and come down to LA?
Man, I have been down here for almost 10 years now. So 9 years, I think. So 9 years ago. And I actually initially moved to Long Beach, which is where I've spent most of my time down here. I was doing a long distance relationship thing with my girlfriend at the time, who was actually from Seattle, and she'd been down here a lot, like quite a bit longer. She went to school down here and stuff. So we had sort of reconnected later in life, and we're sort of doing a long distance thing for about a year. And it sort of became time to where she was either going to move back to Seattle or I was going to bite the bullet and move down here. And I thought, honestly, like, why not? Like, she was coming up to visit so much and vice versa that I thought, like, I'll just move down to Southern California. She was really stoked on Long Beach. And I think she's become, like, so fully acclimated, she was never going to go back to the Northwest. So I just decided I'd come down and, like, try to see how that worked and, like, try to get a job and all that stuff. So, yeah, it's been almost 10 years now, which actually sounds super crazy and totally blows my mind.
Now, you mentioned trying to get a job. At what point, because you're a graphic artist, you're a working graphic artist. I know it might be a little harder now because of what's going on, but how did you get into being a graphic artist?
It's probably a similar answer to a lot of, what we covered of how someone discovers music or gets into bands or gets into cinema and stuff. It was just sort of a natural progression. I always liked to draw. So one of my big hobbies and focuses as a kid was quote unquote being an artist. I just always really enjoyed drawing, and it's something I've done like for as long as I can remember. So I sort of reached a point as a teenager where I sort of had to figure out like a way to parlay that into some type of a job or career or some sort of future endeavor, because I never really wanted to do much else. Like I did pretty well in like English and history. I never liked math. Like, so, you just reach that point where you're like, I got to do something. Like I have to figure out some way to parlay something I'm interested in into like an adult job career type thing. So I actually enrolled at the Art Institute in Seattle, but at the time they had a counselor type of career advisor person who pushed me into doing computer animation. And again, at this time, like you got to remember, like it was like just post like the birth of like Pixar and all the like insanity that was going on there. So you had like this combination of like Pixar and like Microsoft world where everything was like very technologically based. And so, I was just at this crossroads where I was like, okay, I'm an 18-year-old kid who really likes to draw. Like, what am I supposed to do with myself? And so they sort of like edged me into going into computer animation. And I thought, yeah, okay, I don't really know what that means, but that sounds cool. Like, I'll do that. And I got into the program at the Art Institute for computer animation and maybe did it for a year, like maybe not even quite a year. And like, I absolutely hated it. I hated everything about it. I was like skipping class because I hated it so much. And again, like being in Seattle, it's like every time there was like a sunny day, like I would go skate instead of go to class because I would like take advantage of the weather every time it was nice. So I was like, anything I could do to not go at that time, I was pretty much doing because I was so unhappy. And to me, it didn't feel creative at all. Like I had this computer class, like I remember my first year where you walked in and like post introduction, like they were teaching you how to like start up and use Microsoft Word. And I was like, I don't think this is the right career, man. Like, I know how to use a computer. I know how to type in Microsoft Word. So it was like so like remedial and like rudimentary at like how they started that it really sort of like rubbed me the wrong way and kind of like left a weird like bad taste in my mouth. So it was way too focused on the technological aspect of quote unquote art or design and not so much like the sort of old school like hands-on organic type of stuff that I was into, like silk screening and, you know, again, just like drawing and painting. Like I had classes at the time. I had like a cartooning class and probably like life drawing, you know, and I even at one point I had an airbrushing class. But outside of that, everything was just like, you know, learning like Photoshop 4 or whatever it was at the time. And like just this very, like it felt very sterile and very much like really just learning computer shit and computer classes as opposed to like art. So I switched my major, like I say, like into a first few quarters that I was really unhappy. I ended up switching my program from computer animation to graphic design, which I felt like a little more in tune with. But then again, like I was so unhappy at the Art Institute, I didn't finish it and I ended up just dropping out. And again, just sort of like teaching myself a lot of stuff, getting a hold of like those old like Photoshop discs and installing them on my PCs and like learning how to use them. And then it, again, like, you know, into my early 20s, I started working as like a screen printer. So I was learning like how to develop, you know, and burn screens and how to coat screens and working with the transparencies and all that. So I started screen printing t-shirts and like that was all the stuff I wanted to get into. Like I always like movie posters and rock posters and like obviously skateboards. So once I sort of got into silk screening and a kind of a more hands-on thing, I sort of like probably became like a little bit more well-rounded. So I didn't really honestly have like a focused career or any sort of like real legitimate job as a graphic designer until I was 30 years old, which is, you know, it's cool in a way. And it's probably, you know, I probably made some questionable choices along the way, but you know, that period from like 20 to 30, I wanted to do anything but just have a job. So it's like I was always playing music. I was always in bands. I wanted to go on tour. I was always quitting jobs to go on tour, whatever it was. I sort of just had throwaway jobs. So it really wasn't till the year I moved down to Southern California that I started getting a little more like focused on career. And a part of that came with moving down here and knowing that like the industry that I always would have dreamed to like want to work in is like the sort of quote unquote like action sports, but like the skateboard type of industry. Cause I always felt like, man, that's such a no brainer for me. Like I kind of live the lifestyle. It'd be such a cool atmosphere. So once I moved down here was actually like I spent a year trying to just like get my foot in the door of like that kind of industry and like really start sort of taking jobs seriously. But I was a late bloomer with careers. Again, like I didn't really start getting serious till like 30, 31. And I mean, I spent 12 months in Southern California sending resumes and applying to jobs I never got. And it took a year of that, like literally around the clock of submitting and applying and trying to get jobs before I ever even got like an email back. So the hustle is real, man. But I will tell you that like tenacity pays off. But sometimes things take a really long time. But once you kind of get your foot in the door, it's a little bit easier to stay. So it's been a long journey.
Now, you've done graphic design for some pretty big companies, and like, what was the first company that kind of like, I don't want to say took a chance, but decided like, hey, we like your stuff, we want to work with you, we want that, to quote Barton Fink or paraphrase Barton Fink, we want that Eagle Barber feel.
Yeah, I mean, again, it was my first job down here. My first job in the industry was working for Quicksilver, which is primarily known as a surf company, obviously. They dabbled in skate as well, and at the time they had purchased Tony Hawk's namesake, so they had a Tony Hawk brand. So after a year of applying to jobs down here and like literally just 12 months of straight rejection or being ignored, I finally got my foot in the door. I got an email back from Quicksilver about a job, and I just, again, it was the right kind of time and the right place that my resume sort of landed in front of the right person. And like sometimes that's just, it really takes that sort of perfect storm of all scenarios to sort of like get you where you want to go. So I just got really lucky because I think at that time I had applied to Quicksilver and DC Shoes and Vans. Obviously, I'd applied to all these companies like numerous times. Every time there was a job opening, I was applying, and like I say, 9 times out of 10, I wasn't even getting any sort of a response. So I got really fortunate with Quicksilver in that their HR career person first saw it, and I went in for an interview, and then of course like he sent that to the position that was hiring, and I went in and I had to do like 3 more interviews with them, and so the whole process was so drawn out and stressful. And but I think that woman who actually hired me at Quicksilver first, her name is Krista, and she was sort of probably the first person to really take a chance on someone that didn't have a lot of like industry experience. And I was just sort of this like dude who had been floundering around most of his adult life, like sort of wanting to be an artist. And so, yeah, I'd say she probably took a chance on me. And I had a really creative resume at the time, and I sort of put like everything into my resume. And it was really weird. I had like this really bizarre, like super, probably like overly creative resume. It was like probably pretty obnoxious, but like I got so tired of like getting ignored by every company I tried to get a job for just by like sending kind of your cut and paste, like word-based resume, that I put together like this really just out of control resume, and it finally like got in front of the right set of eyes and resonated with someone. So I got hired at Quicksilver, and that was like I was 31 at the time, and that was my first job in the industry, and that was my first kind of break, like getting my foot in the door. And I've made connections and friends and coworkers, you know, back then that still remain in my life today. So it was awesome. I was just like totally ecstatic, man.
I guess we should talk about this a little bit. So about how we all met, because I guess you and Nick were in a band together. Do you guys want to talk about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, Suspect.
Suspect, yeah.
With Paul, who also worked at Quicksilver when you did.
That's right.
Is that how you guys knew each other?
I didn't even know Paul when I started working there, man. Like, yeah, it's crazy. Let's see. I don't know how long you guys, because you guys were a band before I joined, and you had done the demo for sure. I think that's all you had out, right?
Yeah, like maybe a year or something.
Maybe a year or so
before you joined.
Paul and I had a mutual friend. It was our friend Kim, and I think she's the one that first tried to connect us when I first got the job at Quicksilver. I think she had mentioned to Paul, like, oh, hey, my friend just got a job at Quicksilver. You guys should be friends. And I think because Paul, who's like similar to me, Paul was like, nah, I'm good. Like, Paul like had no interest in like having a new friend, which is like totally what I would have said if someone tried to like match make me to a friend. I'd be like, nah, I'm okay. So I think that's sort of how like the introduction to Paul went. I think Kim tried to push him to be friends with me, and he was like, nah. But then, of course, like we ended up having so many mutual friends, and obviously like working in the same building, and sort of connected and became friends over the years. But at the time, I had no idea like Spencer was in your band. And of course, I've known Spencer since, you know, my bands were coming down here from Seattle when I was 20 years old, like playing at the Che, you know, because he was booking all of our shows. And like, I have flyers from like our old bands playing with Spencer's band in San Diego.
Awesome.
So it's just that small world stuff, you know.
We should mention that Paul was in a band called Tear It Up from New Jersey, and like he worked for Quicksilver, he worked for FX, like he does his own art as well. So
he's an old head too, yeah.
So give a shout out to Paul there.
What's up, Paul?
And Jim, you did a music video for us at one point.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
That's how the two of you most likely met.
Actually, I met Jim at our show that we played in LA at Tuna's old house.
Nice.
Yeah, I think he came to film it or something. It was probably for part of that video. And yeah, we played a house show, and Jim was there to film, and I think Jim was outside in a Death Waltz t-shirt, and I think that's why I was like, oh, this guy's on the level. Like, I don't know anybody into that shit, like in the hardcore world or whatever, you know, like I think I started talking to him because I saw his Death Waltz Records t-shirt. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that's how we hit it out. Because you're like, yeah, I'm into like the soundtrack stuff, and like it's like cool. And then we started talking about movies because we had 2 shoots on this music video. It's weird talking about me shooting music videos because that seems like a lifetime ago.
I mean, that show seems like 20 years ago. I don't even remember when that was. I mean, Jesus, like, I mean, it was a long time ago now, several years. But I don't know, Nick, do you remember like when was that show, man?
5 or 6 years ago.
That's a long time ago at this point. It does. It feels like a lifetime.
I met you basically by shooting that Suspect music video, and then I guess at the time I was sort of working at the Egyptian Theater. I was definitely working for Beyond Fest then.
Yeah.
And I think it was the second year of Beyond Fest, which was the one I first worked on, that we ended up doing a Christmas show. We did Silent Night, Deadly Night, and Christmas Evil. And you're like, hey man, I'm a graphic artist, and you sent us over a flyer to use, and it was like really good.
Thanks, man. I guess we had been Instagram friends, and maybe you posted something about that Christmas screening, and yeah, I think I just reached out and was like, yo, man, like I'd love to just put a poster together for this, like just to kind of like be a part of it, just because I was like jazzed, and I felt like it was sort of lacking like in LA with a lot of the stuff that goes on, like a lot of screenings. I felt like they were just kind of relegated like Facebook posts or tweets or like, you know, Instagram posts. I was like, I didn't really feel like a lot of people were doing much marketing or like doing any sort of like visual marketing stuff to like get the word out there on things. And so it's like with like bands, like shows and everything else. I just wanted to be like, hey, I want to make a cool poster. If you guys want to share it or put it up, that's awesome. Like, I'm not looking for anything. I'm not asking for anything back. It's just like, I'm stoked on the screening and I'm stoked on what you guys are doing. So like, here's a poster. And I think you were like, yeah, cool. I'll send it to the guys, or I'll see what they say. Or maybe you were like, I'm never going to show them this. I don't know. You know?
No, I actually really love the poster, and like I held off a little bit because someone else was supposedly working on a poster and I didn't want to step on toes. But then that person took too long, so I just forwarded on. They're like, fuck, this is great. So like, I know they started posting it after that, which kind of leads into like, I guess a couple years after that was when I started Cinematic Void. And he was like, hey man, can you help me out with some fucking graphic design? Or you're like, hey dude, I want to be part of this. I can't remember how that actually worked.
I think you reached out to me just for a logo, and I'm going to see if I still have it, because remember, it had a different name at the very beginning.
Yeah, originally, like when I was starting, before Cinematic Void became a thing, was trying to figure out the name, and Christian Parks, who's the main guy behind Beyond Fest, had suggested Oddity Society, and I was like,
yeah, that's right. Okay,
that kind of works. And then I kind of asked you for it, but then like the more I thought about it, the more it didn't seem right. I don't think it's a bad name, and I actually hope someone uses it as like their film programming series, but like. Because I remember there was a night that my wife and I sit down, we took down some paper, we wrote a bunch of different words, and basically she helped come up with Cinematic Void. And she's like, what do you like about it? It's like, well, what I'm trying to do is fill the Cinematic Void. And then I was like, hey man, I know I already asked you for this fucking logo for Oddity Society. Do you mind doing one for Cinematic Void? And you're like, yeah. And then like,
it's like everything else, man. And it kind of goes back to like the DIY kind of like punk and hardcore spirit. Like, I don't hardly do anything for money, like, ever. And like, it's good and bad, and it's detrimental to like sort of like furthering my career or like other opportunities or just being like a fucking adult. But like, at the end of the day, I really don't care about money. Like, I just don't have any interest in sort of like being capitalistic about fun, creative work. And the way I've always seen it is like, I have like a full-time 9-to-5 job, and I go there. Well, I did pre-COVID-19, but generally speaking, it's like I go to work and they pay me to be there from like 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and that enables me to pay my bills. So outside of that, it just enables me to like do stuff either that I want to do, or contribute to stuff that friends are doing, or put stuff together for bands, or obviously stuff like Cinematic Void. Like, I just really enjoy doing it. And so, yeah, it really ballooned out of just doing that first logo. And it's funny because just recently I did find that Oddity Society stuff. It's on a hard drive, or maybe it's on my MacBook somewhere. And like looking at it now and like looking and hearing the word Cinematic Void, like Cinematic Void is way better. it's a way better name. It's like way better visually. So you guys probably made the right choice to transition out of that.
I mean, because I hadn't announced it yet, and then when you sent me the logo, and I just looked at it, I was like, "Fuck, this is like a real logo." And like, I've been in bands, I've done like creative endeavors, and like, I'm not, I'm not trying to diminish anyone that ever did art for like anything I worked on, but like, it was just seeing that, it's like, wow, this looks legit, and like, it kind of gave the whole thing more of a focus. And
Yeah.
then the next thing is like, well, why not start doing like flyers or posters for all your shows?
Yeah.
And I was like, he'll do a few, and then he'll be like, hey man, I can't do it anymore. I ran out of time. And now it's like 4 years later, and you've basically done a flyer for every single fucking show
Yeah. It's
or
crazy.
screening
Man.
I've done.
I keep all that shit and I have it either on my iMac here or like I have a hard drive with stuff. And like, truth be told, like I used to work on some of that stuff at my old job. Like when I was on the clock, like I would work on. So like I have a thumb drive from like one of my last jobs and there's like a Cinematic Void folder because I was like secretly doing like posters and stuff at the time. But it's crazy because I look through there and I look through the files I have on my computer and it's like, dude, there's so many posters. But again, like sometimes that stuff takes me like 10 minutes. Sometimes it takes me an hour. It honestly like just depends on sort of like where my mind's at or what I have going on or like, frankly, like sometimes what the movie is. So it's not like things that I'm like, again, it's just like fun stuff that I really enjoy doing. And so I think that like, post logo, I think you were doing your first screening and I think I was like, yo, let me just make a flyer for this or let me make a poster or whatever we called it at the time. And I think that was that X-Ray and the Sinful Dwarf? Was that the first one?
Yeah, that we actually did 2 shows the first month. We did X-Ray on the Friday, and then we did Sinful Dwarf on the Sunday or Saturday or something like that. I forget what it is, but it was like pretty much back to back. And I was like, just make one flyer with both shows because like I also didn't feel like man, I don't want to ask them to do too much here.
Yeah. It was a double feature flyer, but I have it right here in my Cinematic Void folder.
Now, recently, I went on Instagram. I already have them on the Cinematic Void website, and I just like, you know what, fuck it. I'm just gonna make a story with every single poster you made.
That's awesome. That's
and
cool.
like, and just kind of going back and like the thing, and this is something for if anyone's listening that is like looking into film programming or just being creative or like marketing itself, is like visualization and marketing and having an aesthetic is important. You can't just do random shit. And like what you inadvertently helped me with, and I'm forever grateful for, is you gave at least the artistic like aesthetic to the art and the logo and the posters and stuff. And it's just up to me to pick the fucking stupid movies.
No, man, there's thoughtfulness to the screenings. I mean, the programming, I'm sure, like for sure. And I mean, it's funny again, like the stuff I do for Cinematic Void, it's obviously referential from the movies that you show. So like, I'm always like, obviously pulling images and like reference from stuff. It doesn't look anything like the stuff I do at like my normal 9-to-5 job. Like, I mean, it's like if you like, I guess if you set out to like really pinpoint if I had like some sort of a style, it wouldn't even really be like the Cinematic Void stuff. It's just the sort of like fun outlet to like take some stuff from the stuff you're showing and put it into some sort of like fun visual thing that's going to get somebody's attention on Instagram or whatever. But it all just stemmed from fun. It just, you were doing stuff that I was really interested in. And I feel like, again, a lot of times with people that do events or program stuff like this, there's always sort of a lack of just any sort of like real true visual marketing. And I used to see that with bands and stuff too. There's been so many bands I've missed over the years. And it's like the day will come and go and I'll be like, I didn't even know about that show. I didn't even know that band was playing. Like there was never a flyer made. It was like, well, I mentioned it on Facebook, and like that's, people got to this point of laziness where it's like their whole event would just revolve around, well, I made it a Facebook event. And it was like, man, that's literally like just the most phoned in, like easiest remedial thing you can do. Like, because again, like coming from that world that we probably all did, it's like you made physical flyers. You went and you stole them from Kinko's. You handed them out on the street. Like you plastered them up all over town. Like there was no just like, I mentioned it on social media and like hope that people would come out to my show. So I think like a lot of that's a backlash to like sort of that kind of behavior because I hate that shit. I honestly hate social media, but I think people have just gotten to that point where like, they just sort of like phone in. It's like they do the bare minimum. And then, a lot of times bands or whoever, like they get bummed out that nobody shows up, but it's like all you did was take the time to like type out some shit and post it to Facebook. I mean, it's no wonder like you're not getting any sort of like turnout, or you're not really engaging with anybody. So it's like, yeah, I was like, oh, you're going to do movies, like let's do posters or flyers or whatever every time you do it. Because even though it is social media, it's still like a fun visual way to like try to get the word out there, which I think is like super important.
I mean, I just think it's like at the end of the day, at some point, you and I are going to do a book where like I'm going
Yeah.
to talk about the movies and all your poster art's going to be in there. And like I think it's just important because like in many ways, I feel like the posters help sell movies that people might not have given a chance on. It's like, wow, that looks cooler. I you know, I feel like that some of the posters have like sold shows that like no matter how much I could have paid for fucking ads,
Yeah.
I wouldn't got the traction without like being visually stunning. And and I don't I think I've said it at least privately. I'm gonna say it public. I'm always grateful for all the work you do. So thank you, Eagle. You've
Hey,
done. I mean, from
means a lot.
I guess we could talk about like what do you think the state of like movies and music is right now? Because we've obviously talked from our like old man on a porch yelling at kids in our lawn perspective. What do you think of what's going on now with all this stuff?
I think it's hard to say like literally right this moment with everything that's going on in the world, I guess, man. I would say that like you could probably look at it from one angle, that things from like say a music perspective have maybe gotten better, and that like the demand for like vinyl records or whatever has sort of like forced new pressing plants, or the ability for like bands to put out records again, because there was a period like again say like the early to mid 2000s where like bands were only putting out CDs. I mean, which is like the lamest thing in the world. Like, and I was in bands at the time that was like, oh yeah, we got a new record. It's on fucking CD, which is just like the most throwaway, like shitty media compared to like, I mean, if you're a record collector like I am, and like obviously I know Nick is. So I kind of feel like things have swung back the other way with sort of that desire to have like that physical analog media, and again like going back to that just vibe of like holding a physical record and opening up this giant 12-inch sleeve and being able to see the artwork in a large scale and read through all the liner notes. And these companies like Death Waltz and Waxworks, I mean all these companies that like, I mean you never would have imagined like however many years ago there'd be like multiple companies specializing in like the release of like weird European soundtracks on vinyl. I mean, that's something that I would have thought was the coolest thing in the world 20 years ago, and it never would have crossed my mind. So I think a lot of that has really gotten better, and there's sort of like the pendulum's almost like swinging back towards a focus on sort of that craft, like analog, like creative endeavors that are actual like physical media, which I think is rad. I've probably got a little bit to the point like later in life where like I certainly will buy like digital downloads of bands' new records like on occasion, or obviously like the advent of streaming movies nowadays is awesome. And the fact that like, yeah, when you're in the midst of a global pandemic and like you're really not supposed to leave the house, you can pretty much find anything online to watch. Like that's obviously great. It's convenient, and obviously in a time like this, it's super cool. But at the same time, like I think there's a huge divide between just streaming a movie at home or downloading a band's record and getting like an MP3 download of music, compared that to going to a record store and buying physical media and taking home an actual vinyl record and putting it on a turntable. Is kind of the equation of streaming a movie is going to a theater and having like that communal experience, which I don't even know, obviously, people that follow Cinematic Void, everyone in this conversation, like we obviously understand and appreciate the act and the, like the community experience of going to a movie, and that sort of like, cliche as it sounds, a sort of magical moment of like being in the dark and watching something on a big screen. Like it's one of the baddest things in the world. And, I think it's probably shown with how much success you've had with Cinematic Void that there's clearly still a market for that. And there's clearly still an audience for that. So I think it's awesome. And I think it's probably, again, like swinging back the other way a little bit with a lot of this repertory stuff and a lot of these programs and stuff like you're doing. But then at the same time, like I see like a lot of theaters I used to go to, or a lot of places that I had sort of my first like really religiously awesome communal experiences in theaters, like they're long gone, they're closed, they're torn down or converted to other spaces. So I don't know, man, especially in a place like LA, and especially after, post COVID-19 economy, I don't know what to expect. I think that, I guess the positive spin again is you look at all this stuff about how drive-ins are kind of booming again. I think that's probably one of the only positive things that's come out of like current events or reading the news of what's going on, because you do have people that are sort of dedicated to wanting to get out and have that sort of communal experience. And this is sort of forcing them to go back into these sort of archaic ways of living, which I think is kind of cool. But I don't know what the future holds. I don't know when things are going to be back to a point of normalcy where things like going to the movie are just, something that you take for granted again. You can do whatever you want to go, or, times when you can go see a band and go see live music, just again with that sense of normalcy. It's really crazy, man. It's unprecedented times. It's definitely it's wild to think about, and I'm definitely getting a little bit anxious to kind of see where it goes or when things get back to that point. But I, unfortunately, being a man of science, a person of science, and not a person of faith, I can't say that it's looking too positive on the horizon in the near future. So I don't know. That's a long-winded answer, but it's been a lot. It's been a lot on everybody's mind lately. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of weird because like I don't really have an answer for what the final outcome is, because I've definitely seen some like the cost analysis and like the safety requirements it would take to like open a theater again, and this is me personally, I'm not speaking for the place I work or anything like that. Like, I don't know if I would be ready to go to a theater under the circumstances as they are now.
Sure. Yeah.
And that kind of sucks to say, because like I love going to movies. There's nothing better than seeing a movie with a bunch of like-minded people and just like getting immersed in and like laughing, screaming, having a good time.
Yep. 100%.
Or in some movies that I show, having a really bad time and having your night ruined. But
yeah. There's sometimes one and the same. I don't know. Like there's the whole it's so bad it's good thing about movies too, which I don't really largely buy into a lot, but there's certainly exceptions to that rule. But I think that's the biggest concern, is that there's this real widespread like selfish entitlement to how people are behaving right now, where it's like you got to understand that like literally everyone in the world is in the same boat right now, and everyone's sort of tired of being home, and everyone is sort of tired of how things are, and everyone wants to get back to the normal, and everybody wants to get back to the way things were. But just because you want to, just because you think that like, someone's infringing on your freedoms by suggesting that, you're not smarter or tougher than a fucking global pandemic virus, like, just because you want to get out, just because you want to go do things and get back to normal, doesn't really mean that you should be doing that. And so I think that's what the most frustrating thing is for all of us. Like, obviously no one chooses to sort of be in this scenario. No one wants to stay home. No one has a desire to be, self-quarantining until the end of time. But like, it is what it is.
We're going to take a quick commercial break, but when we return with Eagle, we're going to talk about what we're reading, watching, and listening to on the Cinematic Void podcast.
Ready for a new skateboard? Then it's time to go to Blazer Surf and Skate. They have all the newest decks, pro trucks, and the hottest wheels. Blazer also has safety equipment, name brand clothes, videos and accessories. Don't forget the latest skate shoes. Get them before they're gone. Only at Blazer Surf and Skate.
Welcome back. You know what time it is. It's where we talk about all the things we're reading, watching, and listening to during this pandemic, which obviously is going to be a lot because we all got a lot of free time. Eagle, since you're the guest, you can go ahead and go first.
Oh man, in the hot seat. Are we going? Let's see. Are we going watching, reading, or listening first, or can it be in any order?
It could be in any order.
All right. So I guess I'll start with watching because it's modern times and everybody's on Netflix right now. But anybody that listens to your podcast is probably going to laugh, but I'm notoriously bad about coming around to shows like really late in the game. And I think part of it is that I don't really watch a lot of like serial television. Part of it is that when shows get popular, I don't want to hear about them anymore. So I become like really adverse to watching them. It's like the more someone hypes a television show and the more popular it becomes, like the less interested I become in wanting to see it. So that's a precursor to the fact that I'm always coming around to shit like really late in the game. So when all of this craziness first kicked in and the lockdown like really put us into like crazy mode, I started watching Peaky Blinders, which has been out in the world now for I don't know how many years. Like Jesus Christ, it's been around. It's multiple seasons. I've never watched Peaky Blinders in my life. So like quarantine kicked in and I was like, I got to start a new show. I got all this time on my hands. I'm trying to keep busy, but at night, like I just want to like sit down and escape and zone out. So I've watched all of Peaky Blinders, like the entire series. And it's probably like one of my favorite shows I've ever seen now, like however many years later. I should look up like when that show actually started because I just started watching it in 2020.
It's a British show, right?
Yeah. It's Stephen Knight, I think, created and wrote, I think, most of it. Looks like it started it's like five seasons. Like that's how behind the times I am. I don't know when it first started. I can't find it here, but that's been a big one for me. Yeah, I watched the entire series kind of front to back over several weeks. I then, in a very similar fashion, started watching Ozark, which was also really pretty good. I haven't enjoyed it nearly as much as Peaky Blinders, but like it's been a good show. It's funny. I feel like we're just doing an ad for Netflix now, so you'll probably get some of that Netflix money rolling in.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, Peaky Blinders and Ozark have been like the big series I've been watching. All your listeners are probably laughing at this point and like thinking I dropped some like awesome new info on some hot new television show. But I was the same way with everything. I was the same way with like Better Call Saul. I'm always like super behind on, and that's mostly because like I don't have like I think it's on AMC. I guess, right? Is that show on AMC? I don't actually have the channel that it airs on like in modern time, so I always have to I always catch shows like when they hit Hulu or Netflix, like way after the fact. So I'm usually kind of behind the times on television shows, but I feel like quarantine, like lockdown, is a good time to kind of get into like serial programming. So I've been kind of catching up on some of that stuff. But movie wise, like I've probably seen all the big dogs this year. I rewatched The Lodge because it dropped on Hulu, and that was one that I saw at Beyond Fest last year. I really dug that one. I watched the documentary on Joan Didion. That was really fascinating. If anybody reads Joan Didion, there's a really good documentary out on her. That might also be on Netflix. So there's another Netflix cha-ching. That check will be coming your way. Listening to, I'm still listening to old stuff. I listen to music that I've been listening to for like years and years. I don't know, like new records, I guess. Like one of the most recent things, I got a new record by a band called Criteria. I don't know if you guys listen to them, but they were sort of around like 10 or 15 years ago, I think is the last time they did anything. And then they sort of got back together and did a new record, and it's like absolutely phenomenal. If you guys are into anything that's like, well, Nick, you've kind of checked out of guitar music, so you'll probably hate it, but it's definitely guitar music. It's definitely like a riff record. It's Steven Peterson, a guy that was in he was in Cursive like way back in the day. I think he was like an original guitar player for Cursive. So Criteria was a band that he did after that. I actually think even after the White Octave, but it's just like every song is like a huge, catchy, melodic guitar song. It's awesome. It's like anthem. It's like anthem indie rock. So I've been cranking that a lot. It kind of puts me in a better mood with everything that's been going on. I've been listening to old stuff, some like new hardcore stuff. There's a band, Abuse of Power, I think from like the Atlanta area. They put out a really awesome record recently. Towards the tail end of last year, like the new Appleseed cast, I thought was like phenomenal. I've been playing that one a lot. It's actually one of my favorites of theirs in like a really long time. I'm listening to some old Beastie Boys because I sort of got reinvigorated after watching that documentary. That ties back into a recent watch. There you go, which is cool. I guess that's it for like watching and listening. I mean, I don't know. It's like trying to come up with like, someone their favorite band. There's like 50 answers. I mean, I listen to iTunes or Spotify like pretty much all day long if I'm working. So it's like it's a hodgepodge of things. I don't know. And then I have been reading a little bit. I read a lot of stuff that's kind of been on my list for a while. So it's kind of like television. Anybody that listens to your show is going to be like, Jesus Christ, man, that book's been out for years. But I read a book called Pen Pal that I thought was really great. I started reading a book called Come Closer that I absolutely hated, and I couldn't even finish it. So I'll throw out recommendations, and I'll throw out things you should never try to read or watch, I guess. And then I'm currently reading a book called Head Full of Ghosts, which had been on my list for a long time. I think if anything, this time period has definitely created like a little vacuum of getting back into reading. So I've been reading a lot of books. And again, these are books that have been out for a while, but they've always sort of been on my reading list. Yeah, I guess that's it for me.
All right, Nick, what have you been reading, watching, and listening to?
All right. I've been listening to that new Big Ghost Conway collab, No One Mourns the Wicked. And that's the only new thing, really. Cool Keith, L'Orange, Time Astonishing, LP from a couple of years ago. I've been listening to that a bunch lately. It's super weird. The producer does like a bunch of jazz kind of stuff. Cool Keith just being weird over it. I just watched Uncut Gems. I paid for it like 2 days before it dropped on Netflix. So
I watched that last night. I watched it on Netflix last night. I actually really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's great. If you haven't seen Good Times,
seeing it.
The other movie that was got the Safdie brothers did is great too. The one with Robert Pattinson.
Yeah,
I think it's Good Time.
Yeah, I've heard that's good too, man. And it's funny because I haven't watched it yet. And when that trailer for Uncut Gems dropped, I was like, I don't ever want to see this. It doesn't look like anything I'm going to enjoy on any level. And then I started hearing all these great things, so I actually watched it last night. And it was really good.
Best Sandman since Billy Madison.
Yeah, yeah.
I also just watched Dark Waters, that new Todd Haynes film. It's awesome about DuPont like poisoning the water in West Virginia. It's insane. Definitely amazing. Mark Ruffalo. And also about the same thing, there's a documentary called The Devil We Know, about Teflon, DuPont, all that stuff. It'll make you never buy something like a non-stick pan again, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And then I've been reading this book called Cows by Matthew Stocco, and I'm about halfway through it. And it's the most fucked up book I've ever read, so I highly recommend it if you want to read something completely fucked up. It's about this guy who gets a job at a slaughterhouse, and I don't know. I won't even get into it, but slaughtering cows is the least fucked up thing in this book. So
I'll definitely check that one out.
That's about it for me.
All right, so reading-wise, I've been still reading Perverse Titillation. It's a book on 60s through 80s Eurotrash, primarily produced in Spain, Italy, and France. The next book I have on my deck is a book called Mexploitation Cinema, which I'm looking forward to reading because, like, as much as I've seen Mexploitation movies, I really don't know a lot. So, hey, it's never too late to learn. That's what I always say and look towards. Watching-wise, my wife and I continue to watch The Great British Bake Off because it is the most comfortable, relaxing show you can watch. We've also watched a couple of riff tracks things. We watched one they did for a movie called Spiker, which is about this team, the U.S. volleyball team, but it's like kind of a sex comedy. It has Michael Parks in it. He plays the volleyball coach. It looks like some stupid thing we would watch on our own. Definitely the riff tracks version is worth checking out. We also ended up rewatching Rock and Roll Nightmare under the riff tracks version, which is a lot of fun. Some non-riff track things I've been watching. I rewatched John Frankenheimer's Seconds, which has been on my list to rewatch for a while, which is quite a bummer movie to watch, especially with everything going on now.
Yep.
And then to double things down, I watched 2 Minute Warning, which is a 70s. It was billed as a disaster movie, but basically it's supposed to take place at the football championship. The NFL wouldn't sign off on it, especially what it's about. But basically there's a sniper hanging out in the scorecard tower waiting to shoot stuff, and like they're trying to get him out before anything happens. And movie stars Chuck Heston, John Cassavetes, Martin Balsam, and it just goes fucking nuts. The last 15 minutes is complete chaos. I don't think you could make a movie like that, especially in this day and age. But it's just like, wow, this is another downer, but it was an enjoyable downer. And I got a bunch of things in my watch pile. I just got the American Horror Project Volume 2 from Arrow Video. It's got a bunch of things I've actually never seen, so I've been wanting to check it out. And what else I got? I got a couple things that I do want to rewatch, and I'm going to say them now, so hopefully I will watch them by the next time we do a podcast. Been looking to rewatch Death Dream, the Bob Clark Vietnam tail flip on the monkey's paw tail.
That's a great one.
Jeff Lee. Yeah, it really is, and I've been kind of dying to rewatch it. I don't know why, because it's going to be another downer movie.
It's a total downer, yeah. Depressing as hell, but it's really good.
But yet I feel compelled to watch it. The other one is Blue Sunshine by director Jeff Lieberman, who did Squirm. And this is basically, Nick and I did a bonus episode of the Cinematic Void podcast a couple weeks ago, or probably longer than that. It's probably been a month. Time is a flat circle, and I don't know what happens anymore. But since we talked about it, it's like I kind of didn't want to rewatch that. And again, that's going to be another downer. So I'm basically subjecting myself to downer movies.
Respect.
And music-wise, I've also been listening to that Big Ghost Limited Conway the Machine collaboration record. I liked it a lot better than the Conway record that he just did with Alchemist. I'm sure someone's going to say that's blasphemous, but it's definitely pretty good. I discovered Unsane put out a record 5 years ago that I was completely unaware about. Don't know how, don't know why, but I've been listening to that. It's called Sterilize. Also found a Carcass song that I've somehow missed that was on one of those decibel like flexi comps, so I put that on. And a little bit more straight edge hardcore, continuing that theme. Put on Path of Resistance the other day, and it made me think that basically Path of Resistance has been prepared for COVID-19 this whole time. If you're not aware what Path of Resistance or who Path of Resistance is, they're a straight edge hardcore kind of super group. It had members of Earth Crisis in it and that kind of stuff. But on the cover of their debut record, they're all wearing face masks because there was a period in 90s hardcore where everyone covered their face with like these like not really ski masks, but like face masks to cover it when it's really cold, so they all look tough and they're all nondescript, and now everyone just looks like they're on the fucking cover of a Path of Resistance record.
And it's 30 people on the cover. I think it's worth mentioning. There's 30 people on the cover, and you kind of
yeah,
right.
I mean, where do you fall on the path, man?
I love Path of Resistance for sure.
I had a feeling you were going to say that.
Eagle, I want to thank you for joining us for this episode of the Cinematic Void podcast. As always, I'd love to have you back. I'm glad, and I love every piece of art you've ever sent my way to use for the Void. And I've already said it, I'll say it again. Eternally grateful for all the work you do.
Oh, you're too kind, man.
And if you're looking for someone to do your art, look this man up. He's got a website. What is your website, Eagle?
You can find a lot of my work on eaglebarberdesign.com. That's probably the easiest way to find me. I don't really do much social media. I have a private account that's really just sort of like a personal account. But for fun, I started making like horror movie posters lately, like sort of based on and surrounding all the stuff that's been going on with the lockdown and the pandemic and quarantine. And I have an Instagram account that's Poster Pandemic, and I've just been doing this stuff for fun, like while I'm kicking around at home. I know you've reposted a lot of the stuff in your stories, Jim, which is pretty awesome. But you can find me there. I'm just kind of posting fun, goofy stuff that I work on at home, and you can always hit me up with like a direct message or hit me up on the website, which is again just eaglebarberdesign.com.
That wraps up this episode of the Cinematic Void podcast. I want to thank Eagle for joining us. And until next time, see you in the Void. And if you want to contribute to Cinematic Void, you can join our Patreon. It's $5 a month, allows you to get early access to the podcast. You also get digital downloads of our audio-visual mixes and so much more. So check it out. Until then, see you in the Void.